Hi everyone, Crista Cowan here with another episode of The Barefoot Genealogist. Today we are talking about name variants and name alternates. So specifically, we're going to talk about how to enter the data into your family tree when somebody has changed their name or when they've used a lot of different variations of their name throughout time. I get asked this question quite a lot when I attend conferences. I've received quite a few emails about this, and so hopefully I'll cover all of the different scenarios. I'm going to be talking about principles in particular. You're going to have to think about how your specific situation fits into the principles that we're talking about. Now, one of the things that I often hear when we talk about this topic is, well, it's my tree, I can do whatever I want. It is your tree. You can do whatever you want. However, there are a lot of automated processes that occur on the back end if your tree is on Ancestry. And you can help those processes work better if you follow some of the standards. So things like the shaky leaf hinting process is going to work better if you follow some of the standards. The automatic search process, when you click search from a person in your tree, that's going to work better if you follow the standards. There are places and times where your tree is going to intersect with other people. And in order to connect you with those people in a quicker, easier, more effective way, it's going to be better if you follow the standards. If you've ever participated in any DNA testing through Ancestry or ever have any intention of doing so, if you follow the standards, it's going to be easier for us to recognize some of those common ancestors in your tree. So yes, it is your tree. You can do it however you would like, but if you follow the standards and some of the best practices that are out there, it's going to be more likely that some of those automated processes are going to work much better for you, enabling you to take your family tree even further. So let's go ahead and dive in. The first thing that we're going to talk about is the difference between a spelling or name variation and an actual alternate name, okay? So variants are just misspellings or versions of the given or surname that have been shortened or altered. So, for example, if William goes by Will or Billy, or Robert goes by Bob or Bobby or Rob, or maybe all four in various records throughout his life. Same concept with women and their given names. Elizabeth can be Liz or Lizzie or Betty or Beth, okay? Eliza, all of those are just variants of a name. Same thing with surnames, right? Sometimes we get way too hung up on spelling. A variant of a surname could have an extra S in the middle or at the end. Larson could be with two S's or one, or with an EN or an ON. Those are just variations of the name. So you have to decide what name you want to go with. Now, in the case of given names, it's going to be most often the full version of the name. Now keep in mind that some men named John, their full version of their name is not Jonathan, it's just John. Some women named Eliza, it's just Eliza, it's not short for Elizabeth. So unless you've actually seen the full version of the name on a record, or have come to the conclusion through other records that was the full version of their name, don't lengthen their name if it doesn't have to be. Now for surnames, it gets a little trickier. One of the problems that we have getting very hung up on spelling is that we forget sometimes that our ancestors didn't even know how to spell. Many of them didn't read or write. And so when we say things like, oh, well, that's how he always spelled his name, that's really not an accurate statement, because they may have never actually written their own name ever in their entire life. They may not have even known how to spell their name. And so we have to just look at all the records, come to a conclusion, and then be consistent about that conclusion when we're dealing with name variants. Now, if you want to track all those variants, that's fine, right? You can track those through the notes. Now, when we're talking about name changes are an actual event that occurs in the life of a person, and it may be formal or it may be informal. Most often we're going to see this with immigrant ancestors. Immigrants who came into the United States in particular, though it does happen elsewhere. We have seen that there is a formal name change process, and sometimes you won't find a name change document, but sometimes you will. Sometimes you'll find that through some courthouse records, or it'll be written right on their naturalization paperwork where they've actually said, I immigrated under this name. This is the name that I now go under here in the United States. And sometimes those name changes are entirely different. Now, sometimes they're just changing their surname, but sometimes their given name also gets changed. Now, other places where we sometimes see this, criminals, that's a good example, or people who are trying to escape their past in some way. We see that with them. And then also people who are adopted into other families or who take on the surname of a stepfather. We see that as well. And so in that case, almost always, they used a particular name from birth until a specific time in their life. And then there was an event that occurred, a stepfather adopting them, a naturalization process as after immigration, whatever the case may be, where they start using the alternate name. And in that case, I would encourage you to do one of two things. You're either going to want to use the also known as fact that you can date and enter, or you're going to want to just add an alternate name. And it's up to you how you decide to handle that. But here's where in your tree you're going to go to do that. So I can come in here under Add and select an event type, and there is an also known as fact. And when I enter that fact, I can then enter some additional information if I have details about that particular name change event. Okay. I can also add another name if I feel so inclined to do that way. I can just come in here, add another name, and then I can decide if I want that name to be preferred or alternate. If it is not checked, it's going to be the alternate name. If it is checked, it's going to be the preferred name. And how that works is the preferred name then becomes the name that's shown up here in the header of the profile page. It's the name you're going to see on your family tree chart. But those other names are going to be accounted for as alternates here on the fact timeline under the name section. Okay, so you decide whether you want to add it as an also known as event in the timeline, or whether you want to add it as an alternate name. And there's really not one preferred way to handle that. I would just encourage you, however you decide to do it, to just be consistent throughout your tree for your own peace of mind. Now, nicknames are another category of name variation. And again, I would encourage you to create a custom fact where possible. Now, when I say nicknames, typically I'm not talking about name variants. If I have someone, for example, this is my second great-grandmother. Her name was Eliza Louisa Frances Jones, and in various places and times she went by Eliza or Lizzie or Louisa or Fanny, and so she has gone by variations of her name in various records throughout her life. But none of those are what I would call a nickname. A nickname is something that is entirely different from their name. It's like when we call someone named William Jones Rusty because his hair is red, or we call someone named, John Smith Buddy because, that's what his brother called him when he was growing up and the name just stuck. Or when, we call somebody Sis, or like those are nicknames. And sometimes those names end up appearing in records, and sometimes they're the names that people end up going by. And so they're not an actual version of the name. So I wouldn't ever account for a nickname of Willie or Lizzie or anything in my tree. I would just make sure I accounted for that in my notes. But if the nickname was something entirely different that might never be connected with them based on their name, then I might add a custom fact. And so I can come in here and I can create a custom event, and I can label that as a nickname, and then add whatever nickname. The other thing that I can do is I can also add it as an alternate name if it's something I feel really strongly about, or if it's someone that I knew well and knew that's the only thing they were ever called. I would also, and I would do this no matter how I handled the other 2 bullet points there, make a comment or a note. A comment is public, so if your tree is public, comments in your tree are public, which means anybody who comes to that person profile will see a little number here, and they'll be able to click on that and it will show them the comment. So if your tree is public and you want everyone to be able to see that and to understand why the nickname, why the name variant, I would make a public comment. Notes are private, so even if your tree is public, notes are only for the tree owners and editors. I use mine for research notes. It's where I transcribe all of my records. It's where I work out my conclusions. It's where I write up my proof summaries, just so that I know why I came to the conclusions that I came to, why the information in my tree says what it says. It helps me keep my thoughts organized. It helps me keep my research organized. And so I use notes for that. But again, this is a situation where whether you decide to create a custom fact for a nickname or add it as an alternate, just be consistent throughout your tree for your own peace of mind and for the benefit of anybody who comes after you, so that they know what it was you were doing. If you decide to add a comment or a note about the nickname, again, just be consistent. Always make it a comment or always make it a note. Don't flip-flop back and forth between the two. So that's how I handle name changes versus name variants and nicknames. Now, somebody invariably is going to ask me, well, if they have a name change, which name should you make the primary name or the preferred name, and which name should you make the alternate name? And again, that is a decision you're going to have to make. In my research, in the way that I handle it, is I always enter their birth name where I've been able to find it. So sometimes it starts out as the name that they died with, because as I'm researching backwards through time, that's the first thing that I come across. And so when I add somebody to my tree, I'm adding them with the name that's on their son's death certificate. And then I find them I find their own death certificate, and that adds evidence to the information that I'm collecting about an individual. But I'm not done, because then I start to locate them in census records and then a marriage record. And then maybe I discover somewhere along the line that they changed their name for some reason, and that it used to be something else. And so in that case, in the way that I handle it, is I would then change the name to what their name was at birth. Now, some of you may have an opposite feeling. Some of you may want to put the name that they chose to end their life with as their given name, and some of you may and use the birth name as an alternate. That's fine. You decide how you want to handle it. But again, the key is be consistent, so that you always know as you come back to your research over time what you've done, and so that others who pick up your research, whether it's ongoing as they see your public tree on Ancestry, as DNA cousins interact with the data in your tree, however that works, or whether it's after you're gone and your posterity is picking up that research, so that they know what has been done. So consistency is the key here. So I choose to use the birth name, or if I can, as close as I can find it, the birth name as the preferred name, and any name changes or name variants as alternates. You may choose to do the exact opposite, and that's fine. Just be consistent. Okay, a couple of other little just cleanup tips, because I get asked, again, these questions all the time. I also see crazy things in trees sometimes, and it does affect all of the automated processes. So yes, it is your tree. You can do what you want, but just keep in mind that it will affect some of the things that are happening in the background with your data if your tree is online. So for women, we always use their maiden name. It doesn't matter who they married or how many times they married. Their surname is always their maiden name. Now, when they get married, of course, you then attach a spouse And our automated processes on Ancestry know that if there's a spouse or 3 spouses, that these are all also alternate surnames for that woman, and those are going to be searched. So you don't have to add them to her name unless you have some other reason for doing so. If her last name, if her maiden name is unknown, which a lot of times, unfortunately, women tend to suffer this more than men in family history research. Sometimes we don't know a mother's maiden name, or, as we're working our way through the tree, that isn't always immediately apparent. Hopefully, that's a space in your tree where you can continue to research. And so one of the easiest, fastest, best ways to know that you need to continue to research that is just leave it blank. If you don't know what it is, leave it blank. I've seen people put all sorts of crazy things in women's surname fields. They put in things like LNU, which stands for last name unknown, but a computer doesn't know that. And new people coming into family history don't know that. I've heard stories of people who are brand new to family history who spend hours and hours and hours looking for people with the last name of LNU because they didn't understand what that meant. Now, again, it's your tree, but I would encourage you to just leave it blank if you don't know what her maiden name is. Now, if you just really can't stand the blank space, and I'm one of those people who can't stand a blank space, it also kind of sometimes messes up some formatting when I'm printing things. I actually enter 5 underscores to create a blank line in that particular data field. So whether it's an unknown surname or maiden name for a woman, or whether it's an unknown given name for an unknown husband, whatever the case may be, I just enter 5 underscores to create a blank line so that my reports format correctly, and so that as I quickly skim down my list of all people, I know exactly where I have additional research to do. If I've put anything else in that field, sometimes it's easy to miss or to skip over. If I didn't know her maiden name and I put in her married name, well, that can be confusing because sometimes people marry cousins or even unrelated people who have the same last name as them. And so is this really her maiden name? Is this really her married name? It just gets a little bit confusing. So this is the only thing in this whole presentation that I feel super, super strongly about is this point, and that is always use women's maiden names. And if you don't know it, leave it blank or enter that blank line, but try not to put something else in that field. It will affect hints and searches and all sorts of things in the long run. Now, the last topic I want to talk about around this idea of names is titles. One of the things to remember is that most people are not born with titles, and so you're not going to include it as part of their name because it is not part of the name that they were born with. No one is born a reverend or a doctor or a colonel or whatever the case may be. So there are ways to handle that. The other thing is that some of those things can change over time. Someone may go from being a captain to being a major to being a general. Somebody may be a reverend and a doctor. For royalty, certainly those names and titles change over time as they are granted different titles as people pass away or as new inheritances are received. And so, again, if you make them part of the name, that becomes super complicated to keep track of. It gets messy. So just keep in mind that titles are not an official part of a name. Now, that said, we still want to recognize people who have earned the titles, whether those titles are military titles or the title of doctor or whatever the case may be. And so there you can add a fact. So you can come into your tree again, and you can add a fact, and there is actually a title fact that you can create where you can add a date of when they received that title and then details about the particular title that was bestowed upon them. And that puts it into their timeline. It makes it an event, and that's important because events are something that have sources. Events are something where you can say, well, they're called reverend because They earned that title when they did this thing, and here's some documentation about that. They earned the title of doctor because they graduated with this particular degree on this date from this place, and here's some of the evidence or documentation to back that up. They earned the title of general because of this military service, and here is the source citation information where I came to that conclusion. So titles, again, not part of their birth name in almost any case. They can change over time. People can have multiple titles, so putting it in as part of the name will just create a mess. And again, it will mess with some of the automated processes because those people are not typically referred to in most records by their title. Now, of course, there's always exceptions to the rule, but that is just kind of the standards for your peace of mind and for consistency. So just some basic tips to wrap up today. Whatever you do, I hope I've beat this drum enough. Be consistent. You decide what you want to do in your tree, and then do that throughout your whole tree. That way you won't have to think about it every single time you come across the situation. That way you'll know exactly where to go to remind yourself why you came to the conclusion that you came to. Do you check in your notes? Do you check in your comments? Do you check in the timeline because you added a custom fact? Well, you won't have to check in all three places if you always do it the same way. Again, don't get too hung up on spelling. Many of our ancestors could not read and write, so they never spelled their name anyway. It's just how others chose to record their name as they wrote that information down. And even our ancestors who could read and write. I have a great-grandfather who I have who was very well-read, very educated, and I have a document where on the front side of the document he signed his name one way, and on the back side of the document he signed his name another way. So spelling just wasn't something that was super consistent or important at the time. Also, and I can't stress this enough, I would encourage you to get in the habit of transcribing records so you know how and why you came to your conclusions. A lot of times we enter things in our tree and then we come back to it because somebody asked us a question or because we want to research the family further or because this is a particular brick wall, and we have no idea why this person has the name they have or why we entered this as a particular birth date or death date or event in their family tree. And so get in the habit of transcribing those records. I mentioned that I do that in my notes, and so let me just show you briefly. When I pop out the notes over here, you're going to see the notes for this particular great-great-grandmother of mine. I've got the 1850 census here that I transcribed, the 1860 census, 1870. I've got some of my own research notes here in italics about things further research that I need to do, questions that I have about the evidence that I've collected. I've got the 1880 census, her 1885 marriage record, 1900 census, and then some family notes from some family members about their memories of her and information they've provided for her. And so you can see here, I've got the different name variants, Eliza, Louisa, as I go through the different records, I find those and transcribe them. And so I can really quickly just glance through my notes, and sometimes when I'm finished researching a person, I will write up what's called a proof summary or a proof argument about why I came to specific conclusions about a person's name, about any events that have occurred in their life, or about any of the relationships in their life. And I keep all of that in my notes. Again, my tree is public, but those notes are private, so nobody else can see those notes. When I'm done researching a person, I may then take those notes or that proof summary that I've written up and make that public, come in here to the gallery and add it as a story or add it to some of the facts in the timeline so that anybody who's viewing that can see that. But the notes are for me to keep me straight, to keep my research straight in my head, and also to help remind me about why I came to certain conclusions about the information that I entered into my tree. Because there are times, I tell you what, I come across my tree and I think, where on earth did that come from? And part of it is because I inherited a lot of my family history from others who had done it before me. And as I go back through their work, it's good work, but without those notes, without those source citations, I don't know where that information came from. And so sometimes those conclusions may look totally off the wall at first glance, but as I dig into the records, they start to make more sense. And so I make notes to myself so that they make sense to me and to others who may come after me. Well, that is all I have planned for you today. Hopefully that answered some of the questions that have been raised about how to handle name variations and name changes and the data entry of all of that into your family tree. If you have any additional questions, feel free to put them here on the YouTube video or come over to the event page on Ancestry's Facebook page. There's an event for this particular video, and you can ask questions there as well. Until next time, this is Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.